Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Military History Q&A, which is diverting somewhat away from military history. But we are the only YouTube channel where I guarantee you that during the coronavirus I will not offer haircuts. Last time, I need to apologize. For some reason, being a complete moron, as I am, I fiddled with the camera and turned off one of the channels. But today I should have fixed it, and you should be able to hear me in double paranoid stereo. Today, we're going to talk about a lot of interesting things. We are going to talk a lot, with everything that entails, about an American invasion of the Japanese mainland in 1945. How that would have gone, and why and how, and all the people, including the Emperor. We're going to talk a lot about him, because he had more to say about this. We're also going to talk about some really weird weapons developed around World War II. And a really, really weird plane, and you do not want to miss this, that the Russians built before. Gotta love the Russians. They build it big and really weird. We are going to talk about the Bat Bomb, which is actually one of those cool untold stories from World War II I think we should mention. But let's start with something lighthearted and interesting. On this day in history, the Germans launched their invasion of Crete in 1941. In 1942, the Japanese just completed their conquest of Burma. And in 1951, James Jabara became the very first jet ace in jet-on-jet air warfare. So, one other thing happened in history today, on this day. But I'm going to share that with you at the end of this episode. See if you can hang that long. Let's start with something weird, like the Bat Bomb. We're going to talk about the Bat Bomb. That was developed during World War II for the reason that America was looking for new and interesting ways of destroying its enemies, of course. And a lot of bombs were dropped over a lot of cities in Europe and in Asia and eventually on Japan. Bombs are expensive, and there's always inventors looking at new and interesting ways of doing things. One of these guys was Lionel S. Adams. He was a Democratic operative who knew FDR and Eleanor. He was a dentist, which in my book makes him really scary and really shady. He had an idea of doing something like this. Now, oddly enough, all his letters to the War Department, yeah, he got nice little replies that, well, gee, thank you for your great idea of burning down Japan with bat bombs, but, you know, thank you, but no thank you. So he finally wrote Eleanor Roosevelt, who he knew from the campaign trail, and, you know, that's how that works. And she got FDR to write a letter to Bill Donovan. That letter said, and I quote, "This man is not a nut." Now, if I was in military procurement and I got that note from anybody, I would read, "This man is a nut." Anyway, Bill Donovan gave him the go-ahead to try to do this. So, Lionel, he gets in his old car and he drives up and down New Mexico and Texas, kind of recruiting science study majors out of the recruitment station. They're about to get recruited into the military anyway, so all the civilian trained scientists he could grab, and they set up shop to do this. They end up in Bandera, Texas to look for bats for this here project, where they end up discovering the batshit man, because he stunk of batshit. And that was his business, but he stood out in the crowd, put it that way, because the crowd was away from him. Yeah, there's a Corona joke in there. Anyway, so they settle on the Mexican free-tailed bat to do this. Problem arose that, well, okay, we're going to put little bombs on these little bats, but little bat can't carry a whole lot. And these bats couldn't carry anything until some brilliant biologist pointed out that they were only testing pregnant females, so they could carry even less. So eventually they team up with Louis Freezer, the father of napalm, and they discovered they could get a bat to carry 18-gram bomb, which is just enough to set a fire. They would make these little bombs and they would put them on the bats. The theory was Japan being built predominantly out of wooden buildings. If they dropped this thing over Japan, theoretically, all the bats would come down, find places to hide and hang in all the buildings. The bomb would eventually detonate, the little 18-gram bomb, and burn down all the buildings. That was the theory behind the bat bomb. So they started testing this by dropping them from bombers. Now, you had to get them to cooperate a little bit, so they found out the bats would hibernate if you kept them cool, so they would freeze the little bats and put the bombs on them. And then, of course, theory being that when the bats warmed up, they would spring back to life. So they dropped them from bombers, frozen, outright, which meant all the little bats just kind of like plummeted to ground and splattered. They had to come up with a better way of doing that. So what they did, they had a huge canister with little rooms for all the bats, where they would be loaded in, hand loaded in, frozen with little bombs. The bomb would be dropped by parachute from a plane. The canister would open up, and as the bomb would sail down, the sunlight and the further down, the bats would thaw and eventually spring to life and flutter out and hang around Tokyo. And they did discover an interesting thing, that these bat bombs it actually worked, and it was actually 11 to 29 times more incendiary than a regular bomb load. So by one bomb load of bats from one plane would be 11 to 29 times more flammable, destructive than a regular bomb load from a plane. So in that sense, it actually kind of worked. Unless you're a bat, in which case it probably worked less well for you. As they tried to get this thing going, Hap Arnold, he wanted to get some photos and some video of this thing to show people. Of course, funding is always a thing. So they set up out at the New Mexico Carlsbad Auxiliary Airfield, the air base, and they had their secret lab out there. And photographers were coming out, videographers would come out to film this thing. So they put, might have looked good, they want to lay them out, and they put the little bombs on the bats so they could show the photographers what they were doing. But basically what they're looking at was a bunch of frozen, looking like dead bats sitting on a table, and that really wasn't that much fun. So I said, well, let's put some light on them, and so the photographers can see, because we're getting dark. And they put some Klieg lights on these things. Now, any of you guys worked in the film business or been around photographers, you know what's coming next. It gets hot around those lights. The commanding general, who had driven down to see what they were doing, his car went up in flames first, and then the officers' club started burning down, and then the hangar caught fire. And the fire department, they were sitting outside their gate. It was not allowed in because they did not have top secret clearance. So after burning down half the airfield, I guess proof of concept, it worked. Just don't wake him up. The Air Force was a little more hesitant about the project. Eventually the project was taken over by the Navy, and a Marine Corps colonel showed up and had to fit over all these handwritten orders that, they've been typed up. They got new orders, and they resumed their experiments. But at this time, all projects that were not deemed crucial, all that money and funding was transferred to the Manhattan Project, saving the lives of a whole lot of little bats. But I think the bat bomb, that's kind of up there. That's up there for really weird weaponry and bad ideas. But you know what? It's not a novelty, because the British had a brilliant inventor named Skinner, and he worked with animals, and he worked with pigeons, and was noticing that pigeons really paid attention and homed on things, and he thought, why can't you use a pigeon to steer a guided missile, a bomb? He eventually wrote the British Air Ministry, or the military department, who were not initially that keen on the idea. But as England at that time was at war with Germany and was not necessarily in the best of shape, he got some 25,000 pounds to continue researching in the pigeon-guided bomb, where they would strap little pigeons in the little harness and train by reward the pigeon to look at a certain target and peck on a glass. Like if you saw a battleship, you keep pecking the glass and pointing at the battleship, you get a treat. That's how he trained the pigeons. That would eventually translate to electric contacts that would go on and off and steer the bomb within the little harness as long as the pigeon kept looking at the ship. And it was actually proved to be quite accurate. It actually worked. However, again, stopped. Money went to the Manhattan Project that the British were playing some part of. The war was won, but after the war, the pigeon bomb was actually brought back up. Now that we had to deal with the Russians as Project Archon, and endured for a couple of years, but the pigeon bomb was never actually set in motion and tried on any ships. But I guess it could have worked, and some innovations and technology came out of projects like this. But we're not the only ones developing weird and crazy weapons. The Russians, and I love Russian tech because it is just so in your face. We're going to make a tank fly. Now, I'm not talking about just dropping a tank out of a plane. We've done that. No. They're going to put wings on a tank and try to make it fly. And they actually tried. Of course, they tried the usual dropping a tank at low level. I don't want to be in a tank that's dropped from a plane, no matter how low the damn level. I know what the suspension is in those things, and it's not that good. They stripped a T-60 tank of all its armor, and they put wings, everything. They built the chassis of the plane around it, so the tank was the body of the plane, and then detachable wings and tail section was built around it, and you would steer the plane by rotating the turret. By steering the tank was connected to all the ailerons and so on, and that would, in theory, steer the tank. And they stuck it on a huge TB-3 Russian plane, which is a weirdity in itself. And now, we still have to remember this is a tank. Even if you strip most of the armaments off it, it's still pretty damn heavy. They stuck a test pilot in this thing, and they stuck it on the TB-3, which had its engines overheat very soon after takeoff because, well, wait a minute, we're still pulling a tank. So they had to release the tank early. And they did. And it flew. And the test pilot landed it. This is an airplane test pilot who learned how to drive a tank. And landed it. Did I mention that he had to turn on the engines and get the treads rolling before it landed in the air while steering it as a plane? Oh, just saying. It's a lot of levers to pull here for a guy in a tank. But he managed to land it and drive it back to headquarters and report on the success. I'm taking it, my personal opinion, the success being that he survived. However, considering the TB-3's engines couldn't hack the stripped T-60, the thought of a fully armored tank or a T-34, so it went nowhere and the project was cancelled. But I think it's a cool project on its own. Back to the Russians and their crazy ideas. Boris Yusupov decided he wanted to make a flying submarine. Well, they're aerodynamic, so it can float, it can sail. So he had a flying submarine with propellers and wings. I don't even know what to say to that, but it didn't go anywhere during the war. But after the war, Lavrenti Beria, the cruel, sadistic, rapist henchman of Stalin, picked up the project. He was from the intelligence. I don't know, I guess he wanted brownie points. And they actually built the damn thing. And they tested it. At least for a couple of years, they tried to make a flying submarine work. And you gotta give it to the Russians. You think it, and you built it. Flying submarine, you gotta love it. Seriously, you gotta love it. But we have to talk about the Kalinin K7, which was the one on my photo of the week from back in the day. And I just think it is just the coolest looking plane. Because, I mean, come on, you get flying autocannons in battleship turrets with wings. How can that just not be cool? I mean, providing I don't have to be flying in it or pilot it or be underneath it when it's in the air. It was originally designed by World War I Civil War pilot Konstantin Kalinin at his Aviation Design Bureau. Now, the whole thing had a wingspan pretty close to that of a B-52, with a tail boom and huge pods underneath the wings for the wheels. It was initially powered by 6 tractor engines, about 750 horsepower each. That's about the same as my Harley, isn't it? No, probably not. Anyway, and it took to the skies on August 11th, 1933 for the first time. It had some stability issues? I am shocked when I read that. I thought for sure they would still be flying today. There were some serious vibration issues that was caused by the airframe resonating with the engines. And it was thought the solution was to shorten the tail booms. So now you have this wide plane. The wings were almost as big as B-52, which was huge for the day. But they were thicker. They were 7.7 feet thick. You could stand up in them still with room to spare. So the shorten the tail boom, it was pretty much a huge flying wing. That didn't quite work out well. They shortened the tail boom, they put on a pusher prop, and stuck 2 more propellers in the pods where the wheels were. Now, in the civilian configuration, it would carry about 120 passengers and about 7,000 kilos, or about 15,000 pounds, of mail. It would carry about 123 fully laden troops. And in the bomber configuration, that's the one I really like, because it had 8 20mm autocannon and 8 7.62 machine guns. Those guns everywhere. And from the pictures, I gauge they put on some more guns. I guess weight was not an issue for flying tractor engines. It could also carry about 9,500 kilos of bombs, which is about 21-some thousand pounds. So it could carry a decent bomb load and a whole bunch of guns. Didn't say anything about airspeed. Dying to know, though. Now, remember I said it actually survived its maiden flight, and I know that is a shock to all of us. I was a little surprised. It flew 7 times before the crash, because you knew there was going to be a crash. We knew that. It killed 14 people and 1 on the ground, which was very unfortunate. One of the tail booms broke. The shortened tail booms. They did not revive the project, and there was, of course, as in Stalin's era, talk of sabotage and espionage, and somebody should get up against the wall and be shot, as pretty much everybody was in fear of happening to them back in the day. Now, with all respect for his war pilot status, I'm not entirely sure that he shouldn't have been shot, who designed this monstrosity and decided it could fly. But the story doesn't say anything about that. But I do think it is the coolest flying gun platform, short of the A-10. And I wish they'd build one, just so I can see it. Alright, so the question is, in 1945, how would a U.S. invasion of the Japanese mainland have gone, and how would it have affected the war? There's a lot to be said about this, so strap yourself in, make some coffee, and pay attention. Because, first of all, there is no one easy answer. Well, yes, the easy answer was, yes, the U.S. would have won and defeated Japan in an invasion of the Japanese mainland. The war in Germany and Europe was over. The U.S. had all the resources needed, had the planes, the ships, the tanks, the manpower, the weapons. The British was coming to help. And the Russians were waiting in the wings, kind of shifting personnel towards the Pacific for theirs. Japan was going to lose the war, hands down. A U.S. invasion, Allied invasion of the Japanese mainland would have succeeded. The questions are now, how expensive would that have been? How costly would that have been in men and people and lives? How many Japanese would have died? How many Americans would have died? What would the Russians have done? So it is not an easy question to answer other than what I just said, because there's a lot of aspects to it, and the aspects makes it interesting because there's a lot of different interpretations by historians since on how and why, and well, Japanese had offered to surrender, but they didn't, but they did. But they'd offered the Russians, and the Russians wanted part of the war, but we had to drop the bomb, but we were winning the war anyway. But then there's a lot to this. And then there's the emperor. What was the emperor's role in this? We always look at Japan as this homogeny, royal Japan, everybody agrees, everybody's falls in line, the emperor's the one to blame. But it's not, because Japan was a very divided country, even from before the war, where there was civil fraction. There was fractions within Japan. Both military, the military was fractioned, the civilians were fractioned, the government was fractioned. The only thing that kept most of them united was the emperor. So everything in Japan sort of goes back to him in one sense or another, but does the blame for everything that happened fall with him? And I want to dive into that a little bit as well, because what the emperor said and did had a profound impact on how the troops and the civilians would fight and endure the war. Now, the Americans' plan for the invasion of the Japanese mainland was pretty straightforward. 650,000 soldiers, 4,000 crafts and ships, and some 2,000 planes of all types were going to land in Operation Downfall, followed by Cornet and Olympic, and basically invade Japan. That was fairly straightforward. Now, 650,000 soldiers sounds like a lot. And throughout the Pacific Campaign, you have to remember the U.S. had about 74,000 casualties for about 17,000 dead up until that point, at the end of the war in Europe, which is not that many. Now, you're looking at, after the war, we could see that several million Japanese soldiers eventually surrendered, but they didn't surrender. They came under control of Allied powers, because the Japanese, it was all about wording, but they still surrendered, and they signed the Declaration of Surrender. But because Japan was configured a little different, things were worded a little different. Interestingly enough, the Japanese got a lot of leeway the Germans didn't get. But we'll get back to that later on. So this is kind of where we are. The American air war over Japan was leveling Japanese cities. In the month of up to August, 26 Japanese towns had been destroyed. And the Japanese Navy had some 75% of its ships sunk, the transport sunk. So there was already sugar rationing started already in 41 in Japan. There was severe rationing. People were starving, and yet they were fighting. And they were fighting for their emperor. Now, we'll get back to him in a second. What would an invasion of the Japanese mainland have cost the Allies? Estimates were between 60 and 105,000 killed in the first 90 days of fighting. That's a lot more than had been lost in the Pacific until then. I think the U.S. had about 400,000 casualties of the entire World War II. So add a quarter to that by an invasion of Japan. That's a lot. So you could see why that might not be something that the Americans really wanted to do. But the Japanese were expected to fight tooth and nail for their homeland, as we'd seen in Okinawa. Also, you've seen propaganda effect, that the Japanese interior propaganda on its population about the terrors of what the Americans would do. It led civilians, women, children, to throw themselves off cliffs rather than be taken alive. And in that sense, even a starving, militarily nearly defeated nation would fight fanatically, because they had been indoctrinated to the point where they would believe, well, first of all, we do not surrender, we're Japanese. It was just simply unthinkable, for one, and with the fear of what they had been told would be done to them, if that would drive them to suicide, it would certainly drive them to fight. And that would certainly rack up the casualty count on the American side. The campaign was expected to take 6 months to a year, and they would certainly also be expecting severe guerrilla activity throughout Japan. So we're looking at a prolonged American invasion with heavy casualties fighting for every brick, even if all the towns would be leveled by bombing. Of course, that was all before the nuclear bomb became a fact. Now, Curtis LeMay, he sort of makes Bomber Harris look like a well-rounded individual. Oh, I'll be nice to all of them. But LeMay, he suggested we drop 3 nuclear bombs behind every invasion beach, and that an hour later our troops would march through, having to kill everything, or poisonous gas. The invasion was set for November. That's important. But LeMay was pretty much ready to destroy all of Japan, even with nuclear bombs. Interestingly enough is, even in November, I'm not sure we could have 9 nuclear bombs ready, because we did not have that much uranium. That's a different story, but we will get back to that, because that was one of the Japanese arguments. But now we have to go back to July, before we even get close to the dropping of the bomb, where Japan had offered to surrender, with condition that their emperor would be kept in place. This was rejected. The Japanese ministers had sent the ambassador in Moscow. Remember, Japan and Russia had fought their little wars over time? Well, they stopped fighting, and Japan was still having diplomatic relationships with the Russians, so they had an ambassador in Moscow. And they sent the ambassador in Moscow specific instructions to tell the Russians that they wanted peace. Have the Russians be intermediaries and broker a peace with the Americans. He was refused by the Russians. It was impressed several times that this was the emperor's wish, that he took this to Stalin. But the Russians wouldn't hear none of it, because the Russians kind of wanted part of this war themselves. Non-aggression treaty with the Japanese or not, there was still something to be had. So Stalin was, after the fighting had ended in the West, begun transferring 101.5 million troops to the Japanese theater, down to Manchuria. And they sprung an attack on Japan in August as well. A lot of things happened to Japan in August, and I'm not sure it's all a coincidence. Stalin wanted to spread communism. That's what communism does. It seeks to spread. And at the end of the war, well, there was all that Pacific spoils that Stalin wanted to take part of. And the emperor was afraid of both the communist revolution in Japan, because there was possible communist revolutions in every country throughout the world. There is some evidence that the emperor was quite fearful, far more fearful, of a Russian revolution or of a communist coup or revolution in Japan than he was of a pending American invasion. Now it brings us back to the emperor, who is an interesting character, and there's a lot of interesting facets to be said of Emperor Hirohito. He grew up in rather austere military school, had no contact with his family, did all the traditional learning, very traditional, austere life as a kid. But he was a scientist, he was a biologist. He was a pragmatic person. He received his education and went to England. Now, England was his first real experience with the West, and with a royal family that behaved vastly different from what he had experienced. He spent 6 months in England, and the royals in England treated him like he was family. And they treated each other like they were family. Now remember, Hirohito, he grew up in a world where his servants' naked hands was not allowed to touch him. They had to wear gloves when dressing him. It was a completely different world to see a familiar royal family in England. And he had great admiration for the British. And he learned a lot from that. That was a life-changing moment for him. Yet, when back in Japan, and he was faced with revolts and uprisings, he would, as one would expect, suppress these very harshly. But was Hirohito really in charge of the military? Japan, it is said the emperor was somebody with influence, but no real power. Japan's way of dealing with the great oppression was with imperial militarism, and then they invaded Manchuria. Something the emperor was not something the emperor was not informed of. The Japanese set mock bombs to blow up a railway, blaming it on Chinese rebels, and they had promised the emperor this would take several months to deal once and for all with the Chinese. 3 years later, they're still at war with the Chinese. And did the emperor know of the atrocities, like the rape and killing of Nanking? It said that over a quarter of Nanking's population was killed, stabbed, raped, burned by Japanese soldiers. And eventually rumors, of course, would reach the emperor, who would ask about this. Now remember, of course, in Japan there's a lot of royals, and most of the royalty were serving in the military. So a lot of his relatives were serving in the military, and a lot of them participated in the killing and the atrocities. So when he asked if these things were happening, it's quite plausible that he was not told the truth. Plausible, we do not know. Certainly, Hirohito was not in charge of the military hardliners. There was even a coup brought against him by his own brother. And he thought the response was a little slow. So he offered he would ride out in charge and lead the royal guard to quench the coup, and which it was done without him having to do so. But that was the first time he really made a military leadership decision. He stood out in front and took charge. Hirohito was not the take-charge military dictator lead that micromanaged the country. Remember, even his cabinet would just seek permission for an audience. The emperor was somebody whose voice had never been heard by the people. People did not meet or interact with the emperor, but they respected him, and he kept the country together. And the military knew that if they kept the emperor, and he supported them, or at least tacitly let them do whatever they wanted to do, the people would follow, because that is how it was at that time. Always remember, history must be seen in the light of the time, not in the light of the present, because we have a different prism today than we did back then, or than they certainly did back then. When Hirohito was told of the attack on Pearl Harbor, to a degree, maybe he could have said he could not have allowed it. But could he? Because he was where he was to a degree because of the military. I have an impression that Hirohito was a very pragmatic person. He had to tolerate the bad to keep the good, and for him the good was the Japanese Empire. He loved his empire, and he wanted to keep it together. There was infighting and fractions, and he knew that, and he was weary of this, and he knew if he kept his alliances with the military, they would protect him and keep him safe, and he would be able to expand his empire. I don't think he saw the expansion by the military as a bad thing, but I don't think he saw it as a good thing. When it was invasions of Koreans, of whom he had not that much respect, probably the same, and the other islanders, they didn't really matter, because they didn't to Japan at the time. Especially not a Japan that felt superior to all other Asian nations. A war with America was a different story. In his diary in 1942, months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, he wrote that he would like to see the Pacific Islands and the Pacific nations, but that wouldn't be a problem, because of course they would be part of Japan's empire. That was before Battle of Midway, where everything turned against him. I don't think Hirohito wanted war, but either he was not strong enough to stop it, or stop the military from waging one, or it was just expected of him to accept this was what the military was doing, since the military was to a degree doing it in his name. There's some interesting speculations that can be made, but personally I don't think he was pining for the war with anyone. But of course he was okay with the spoils of that war. But after Midway, things were turning against Japan, and the Americans were moving closer and closer to the Japanese mainland, and now they're bombing Japanese cities and supplies. And any reasonable person, especially after the end of the war in Europe, saw that Japan was going to lose. And I think, being a pragmatic person, Hirohito knew this. But what he was waiting for was one victory. That one big battle where he managed to stop the Americans at one island or another and inflict serious heavy losses on them as a springboard for negotiations. Where did we hear this before? World War I, Germany. Several years at the end of towards the end of the war on the Western Front, one good victory over the Allies, so we can start negotiations, have a good solid springboard for negotiations. It didn't work really well, and it didn't work much better for Japan either, but I do believe that is what Hirohito wanted. He wanted that one victory, and the military kept promising him the next time, and it just didn't happen. And he lost the momentum, he lost that opportunity. The window, well, the moment they bombed Pearl Harbor, there really was no option for negotiated peace. I do not think. I think the American population would have demanded a complete destruction, invasion, occupation of Japan. Which brings us back to, well, Japan offered peace all the way from July for months, and we intercepted their radio. We knew that fractions of the government was ready for peace, but the fraction of the military were not so much. Now that leads us to the dropping of the nuclear bomb, which is another controversy about that. We have always been told that Japan surrendered because we dropped the nuclear bombs, they knew they couldn't win, and therefore they surrendered unconditionally. Although the emperor was allowed to stay until he abdicated on his own because he really wanted to modernize Japan, so eventually he sort of got the peace he wanted by not having to be emperor. But is that really true? What happened after we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima? The Russians invaded Manchuria within almost hours. Until then, you have to remember, Japan had been fire-bombed almost back to the Stone Age. And we had some 60,000 casualties of the bomb in Hiroshima, but the firebombing of Tokyo had left 100,000 dead. So for the destruction of Japanese towns by bomber raids was nothing new. So because we dropped a nuclear bomb, just one bomb that destroyed a town, in the bigger picture of things, it was just a town that was destroyed, just another one. And in fact, the military had even told the emperor that, this is nothing to worry about. They can't build that many of them. They can't build one more. Remember, the emperor was a scientist and a pragmatist. He wasn't an idiot. He knew the writing on the wall. But ever since 1930, when a communist tried to assassinate him, he was afraid of the Russians, he was afraid of communism. And when the Russian invasion came, that's when the War Council met to talk about, well, what do we do now? Because the Russians steamrolled over some 850,000 troops, Japanese troops in Manchuria, and they were heading for Japan through Korea. Of course, we also knew that the Russians were coming. And even though Curtis LeMay said, well, the Russians can't make it to Japan until November, and by then he would have destroyed every town in Japan, so there was nothing for them to occupy. The real fear was, and in hindsight, both for us and for the Japanese emperor, was that the Russians would steamroll through Manchuria, Korea, and invade the Japanese mainland. Because we were not ready for an invasion until November, at which point, at best, the Russians would have been stopped maybe halfway through Japan, leading a North and South Korea style peace, with one half of Japan occupied by the Americans and one occupied by the Russians. The emperor would definitely have lost his country, half his people, if that had happened. And if we look back retroactively, that would have destroyed the image and the reality of the post-World War II world. It would have given all of Korea, half of Japan, to communism for decades, perhaps still today. So it was imperative for us to end the war before the Russians got to Japan. And it was just as imperative for the Japanese to finally they had to surrender before the Russians got too close. It was several days after the bombing of Hiroshima before the Supreme War Council actually met and talked about the bombing, the Hiroshima bomb. That was not the main point of urgency. The military wanted to keep fighting because that is all they had. The military wanted an invasion of the Japanese mainland because it was the only way they could inflict losses on American soldiers. They were being bombed and attacked everywhere and driven back. They couldn't strike the American mainland. They could barely sink the American fleet. All they could do is hope and wait for an invasion of the Japanese mainland where they could dig in fortified bunkers. They had thousands of kamikaze planes. The last count, there was 6,000 planes, most of them decked out for kamikaze. The Japanese had 7,000 planes ready for an invasion. Most of them set out for kamikaze. And when we talk about casualties of a land invasion of Japan, there's one thing we have to remember. Japan had 400,000 Allied prisoners of war, and the orders had been signed that if Japan was invaded, all of them were to be executed. One would say, well, maybe there would be a few Japanese commanders that would be level-headed enough to not carry out those orders. But if we're looking at 60 to 100,000 American casualties of an invasion of the mainland, we have to add the 400,000 prisoners of war that would be murdered as well. Now we're looking at 500,000 Allied soldiers that might die of an invasion of Japan. And if the Russian had been allowed to continue for only half of the country. So the price for an invasion would have been exponentially large. And after the bombing of Nagasaki, the emperor himself made the decision it was time to stop to fight. But because of the war, it was all the military had. There was a coup trying to stop him from sending out the broadcast of Japan's surrender. In fact, the emperor knew that there might be a coup or some attempt to stop him from broadcasting. So he'd done the recording and had his servants hide it. So when the parts of the military tried to overthrow him, they searched the palace. They didn't find it, and he was still able to get it broadcast. Most of the Japanese people had never heard their emperor's voice before, and he spoke in such an old colloquial dialect that some actually barely understood him. But the meaning was clear. He surrendered, and he surrendered because the Russians were coming, or because we were dropping nuclear bombs on him. We'd already destroyed, in a month before, we already destroyed 26 Japanese cities. So 2 more, just by different means, really didn't have that much of an impact. Especially because the Japanese military, trusted throughout, of course, had told them they can't possibly manufacture a lot of these. And in this, the military was actually correct, because we did not have enough uranium to keep making an unlimited amount of bombs. It would take time. We would eventually, as we all know we did, but it would have taken time. It would have drawn out the war, and the Russians may have beaten us to all of Japan before there. So the surrender of Japan, was it the Russians or was it the bombs? I am leaning towards it was the threat of the Russians' invasion of Japan that was the final straw that led Hirohito to declare for peace and surrender. Something he could have done before. But could he? The military was pretty much in charge, and he was to some degree, from the hardliners in the military, a bird in a golden cage. He was going to sit there and they were going to point to him and say, you go to war for the emperor. The emperor said, where his actions were relatively meaningless. They used him as the figurehead for the war. And I think it's doubtful, say in 43, 44, if the emperor said, now it's enough, we're going to stop fighting, we're going to make contact with the Allies. I do not believe the military would have let him. Incidentally, an interesting thing is MacArthur had already decided that he was going to keep the emperor in place and leave him as the figurehead because it was solidified Japan It would be a sign of coexistence. They were not going to do what they did in Europe. And in fact, Japan got off a lot cheaper from the war than the German war criminals did. Some of the horrific things the Japanese scientists had done were never really punished. And the emperor remained. And as it turned out, MacArthur rather liked him, which was fortunate since now they were going to work together, although the emperor was very nervous upon their first meeting. And I'm pretty sure a movie has just been made about those two gentlemen. But the emperor will always be a controversial figure because in his image a horrible war was waged, and he lived out his life for many years after and eventually succumbed from cancer. Some see him as a hero, some see him as a war criminal. Given the upbringing and his life and his position and that time, I don't think he could have done much different. I don't think he was a bad person. I think he was aware of terrible things that was happening but had little choice to stop them. Just like so many other emperors and royals and kings and princes before throughout the world, they loved their kingdom but were destined to lose it in a frivolous and lost war. Anyway, that is the prospect and outcomes of an invasion of the Japanese mainland. It could have gone a lot of different ways. It could have cost us a new Cold War. It could have cost lots of lives. And I'm saying, fortunately, it didn't. I will say, well, thank God we dropped the nuclear bomb because it ended the war, but I'm not so sure it did. An American general said later on, well, we had to drop the bomb for two reasons. We had to drop it on an unbombed city, because nothing had ever bombed Hiroshima, to see its effect, to know it was a viable weapon of the future. And we had to drop the bomb to let the Russians know we had it. Although they had, at Yalta, hinted it to Stalin, who of course already knew because he had great spies everywhere, but he didn't have his until the 50s. And knowing we had the bomb and were willing to use it may have kept the Russians at bay in the years after the war from taking over all of Europe, from maybe have gone into a fight with us to get Japan or the Pacific or whatever. Stalin was crazy, mad, power-hungry, unpredictable, and if he thought he could beat us militarily with his outnumbering forces in Europe, he might have tried. So knowing that we had a superior weapon system and were willing to use it, that might have been worth using it in Japan for. And I'm terribly sorry for the Japanese civilians. I truly am, because Japanese civilians had very little choice in any matter that happened in their lives from way before the war until the end of it. And that is the terrible part of modern war, is civilians get killed. Problem is, if we hadn't dropped the bomb, other civilians who were equally innocent somewhere else may have paid the price. So it is what it is, and it probably was what it had to be. But certainly the combined effect of the Russian invasion and the nuclear bombs led to a surrender of Japan. Now remember, I told you about something else interesting that happened on this day of May 20th in history. A lot of things happened 1945 on May 20th. The German Uprising at the little island of Texel was finally ended when Canadian troops were sent in to enforce the surrender of the final German soldiers there. Incidentally, I parachuted on Texel. There's a jump school there now, which is nice memory. Been there. Nice beach too. Also, the United States took over Mindanao, finally ended the Battle of the Japanese there. And in Poland, Polish attacked the NKVD labor camp, or camp, signaling a whole lot of unrest on the sides of Poland and Eastern Europe, beginning to fear that the Russians would not leave. And indeed, the Russians didn't. They stayed as an iron grip of Eastern Europe all the way up until 1989. Because of that Russian stranglehold of Eastern Europe, there was a lot of defectors throughout the whole time of the Soviet Union, of the Cold War. And with all the ranting and raving you hear in politics today about how wonderful communism and socialism is, it's a surprise that so many people would risk their lives to get away from it. Now, in 1945, on May 20th, a little girl was born. She would eventually receive a presidential thank you from President Bush. She would run NATO summits at the White House. Well, the Hotel White House. Because she lived in Aalborg in Denmark, where she would oversee the arrangements for NATO summits, Winter Olympics, and she would thus come in contact with a lot of sports teams and also political delegations who were staying at that hotel throughout the time where she managed it, during the time of the Cold War. And remember, it was hard to defect from Eastern Europe. First of all, because if you were there, you had to escape through wall, barbed wire, landmines, automatic machines that were set up to shoot anything that moved. A lot of guards, you had to swim lakes and rivers. And even if you made it, your family might be punished for you having disappeared. So for a defector, it took a lot of work, whether it was in Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia, wherever it was that was under Russian dominance, and people tried to get away. But a lot of the ones who made it to Europe on trade missions, athletics, Olympics, high-level meetings, they had a chance because they were out of the country. But they were watched by the secret police that was always following anybody of any level leaving that country. So if you wanted to defect, one of the first thing you had to do, if you were a politician or you were an athlete, you had to tell someone that you could probably trust to help you at a time where your minders, your Russian minders, your NKVD minders, your Stasi minders, were not watching. And a lot of times those were the conversations with the check-in personnel at the hotel. And remember, big hotels in all over Europe, as there were hotels that worked with intelligence, because they had to keep an eye on who came and who went. So in the Hotel White House in Aalborg, where this woman worked, there was a little police listening communications station in the basement. And they worked with police intelligence, and a lot of people would defect. Well, a lot of them, some would try, and some would succeed by making it known to the staff in the reception that they wanted to defect. And the most important thing for that was to then get them out of the hotel at night or clandestine outwards through there was a lot of different passageways in that hotel where you could get out and get to cars underground, and you can get them away. Because the next day when it became known that they were missing, their secret police from whatever country they were from would tear up the police and watch every exit to see if they could find the person trying to defect. And several times I would wake up in the morning and there would be a strange man or woman on my sofa, because the woman these people defected to was my mom. And she was born today on May 20th. People, they would often talk to her because she was a great personality, and she was a good person, and it stood out. You would know if she walked into the room, you would know. So a lot of these guys, they looked at my mom and they trusted her, and they told her they wanted to defect. She would sneak them through the basement and in the trunk of the car and we would keep them at our house until we could make arrangements with police intelligence or whoever to sneak them out of town. Because, of course, everybody would be stalking around the hotel looking for them, but they wouldn't be there anymore. And, of course, she got her thanks for that. She also ran one of the arrangements for a NATO summit, which was interesting because when I was going up there as a kid from school next to, and I had to be searched by the Secret Service to visit my mom. That was fun. But on this day in history, my mom was born. And to all of you, you talk to your moms about her lives and your mom's lives while you have the chance. I no longer can. You learn something for your family every time you talk to them. And you take the damn time and you talk to your family and you talk to your mom. See you next time.